France. For generations, that name brought to mind the good life, right? Culture, economic power, you name it. But that France, well, it's disappearing. This is the story of how that happened. And it's a huge warning for the rest of the world, especially for America. Let's just start with this one staggering fact. Right now, today, in one of the wealthiest nations on Earth, a third of the population struggles to afford 3 healthy meals a day. This isn't ancient history. This is France right now.
But it wasn't always like this. Not even close. Not that long ago, the French middle class had a standard of living that was literally the envy of the world. I mean, 4 weeks of paid vacation was the law. A good life wasn't just a dream. It was practically guaranteed.
So what on earth happened? How does a nation at the very top of its game, a leader in industry and culture, fall into a spiral of high unemployment, constant social unrest, and economic stagnation? Well, the answer really comes down to 3 critical mistakes. 3 economic sins, if you will. Okay, first, let's set the scene. Back in the 1970s, France was an absolute powerhouse. It helped create the Concorde, the fastest commercial jet ever. It co-built Airbus, which now dominates the skies. It was a place where life was really, truly good for the average person. I mean, just look at the contrast between then and now. It is stark. You go from an industrial giant with incomes just skyrocketing to an economy that has barely grown at all in nearly 2 decades. The French dream? It kind of gave way to a French nightmare. The beginning of this whole story really starts in 1973. An oil crisis hits the entire globe, and prices go through the roof. Now, this shock from the outside forced a choice, and it set France and its neighbor, Germany, on 2 completely different paths. And this is where France made its first and, you could argue, its most fateful mistake. They decided to shield their workers from the pain of inflation with a policy that, it sounded great on paper, but in reality, it was a disaster. Okay, so both nations had a choice to make. And to understand it, just imagine a factory that makes coffee makers. In Germany, the workers agreed to smaller pay raises to keep the factory in business, and the government kept a tight lid on printing money. But in France, a law automatically tied wages to inflation. So if prices went up 10%, wages had to go up 10%. On top of that, the government was just printing money like crazy. The result? Suddenly, a French coffee maker costs $75, while the German one is still just $65. And the consequences were immediate and brutal. By 1977, French companies just couldn't compete anymore. They were losing billions. Germany, on the other hand, became an export superpower, making billions. For France, this was the beginning of the end for its industrial base. Jobs just started vanishing. Now, the damage from that first mistake left France really vulnerable. So when the second global shock came along in the 2000s, the rise of China as the world's factory, it was another one of those survival of the fittest moments. And once again, France and Germany made opposite choices. Instead of trying to get more competitive to face this new global threat, France doubled down. It trapped its own economy in policies that made its workforce one of the most expensive and inflexible in the entire world. This was mistake number 2. The main policy here was the 35-hour work week, but you still got paid for 39 hours. Now, the theory was pretty simple. If your current employees work less, companies will have to hire more people to pick up the slack. The reality? French labor just got even more expensive and a whole lot less productive. And it got worse. Firing an employee became an absolute legal nightmare. A business owner could get slapped with a fine worth 4 years of an employee's salary if a judge just didn't agree with their reason for the layoff. It created this paralyzing fear of hiring anyone in the first place. Why would you take the risk? The numbers here are just devastating. While Germany was reforming its labor laws and grew its industrial base by 25% to compete with China, France's industrial base actually shrank. They were basically exporting their own industries. So 2 terrible decisions had now left the French economy totally uncompetitive and inflexible. So when the 2008 financial crisis hit, the country was just too weak to handle another shock. And this exposed the final fatal flaw in France's whole model, and it led directly to the 3rd mistake. When the crisis hit, Germany took its medicine. It accepted some painful austerity measures to fix its finances for the long run. France did the exact opposite. It used massive government spending and debt to just pretend the pain didn't exist. It was like an athlete taking painkillers to keep running on a broken leg. But those painkillers, they can't hide the underlying problems forever. To pay for all the tax cuts and the wage bonuses and the energy subsidies, France's national debt just exploded. It soared past 100% of its entire economic output. A huge driver of all this debt is social spending, and the biggest one is pensions. This chart right here shows you just how unsustainable it all became. France spends 14% of its entire economy on pensions. To put that in perspective for you, the US spends just over 5%. That is an incredibly heavy burden for a shrinking workforce to carry. So why does this long, slow story of France's economic decline matter to you? Well, because the very same mistakes, fueled by the very same political temptations, are being debated in America right now. You might be asking, could a country really choose policies that feel good in the short term but are completely destructive in the long run? The French experience proves the answer is a big, flashing yes. It gives us a real-world roadmap of how popular political decisions can lead step by step to a nation's decline. So these are the warning signs. Things like automatically linking wages to inflation, creating rigid labor laws that scare businesses away from hiring, and funding massive social programs with enormous debt. All the things that crippled the French economy, they have advocates in the United States today. France is a crystal clear case study of where that road leads. The lessons from France's story are simple, but they are hard-won. Germany accepted short-term pain for long-term health. France did the opposite. Politicians who promise easy, short-term gains often get rewarded on election day, but it's always the next generation that has to pay the price. Ultimately, it really just comes down to this. Over and over again, at every single critical moment, France chose short-term comfort over long-term competition. And now, the bill for all of those choices has finally come due. Today, a new generation of leadership is trying to force through some really painful reforms to make France competitive again. But it sparked massive protests, social chaos. And that leaves us with the final, urgent question. Can the damage actually be undone, or is it already too late?